All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I apologize in advance if my dog continues to bark. I think today there are some folks working outside on the street, and so he thinks that it's garbage day and that it's his nemesis, the garbage truck. So thank you for being understanding about that. But we will go ahead and get started as folks are still continuing to filter in. We have a lot of content to get through today, and I want us to be able to leave time for the group dialogue sessions. So we're going to do a little bit of introductory content, and then we'll get you into a group discussion. While we're gathering, just show of hands, because this will be helpful for us. If you can go into the participants area and raise your hand, if you were able to be at last week's plenary, the opening plenary, that's helpful for us, particularly as we're thinking about how deep to go into our overview and review. Oh wow, it looks like almost everybody was able to be there on Friday. Okay. Fantastic, thank you. You can go ahead and put your hand down. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so if you weren't able to be there on Friday, or if you were, you may remember that we talked a lot about the environment that we're in right now as being something that kind of comes out of nowhere and has some pretty monumental effects afterwards. And we talked a little bit about the asteroid that came from outer space and wiped out the dinosaurs. You know, it changed the landscape forever. And the species that survived were the ones that were adaptable and able to respond to a new environment fairly quickly. And so we were really talking about being adaptable in the face of some pretty calamitous changes that seem to come out of nowhere. One of the things that you may remember from Friday, Nabil gave us an overview of the higher ed environment and kind of on the national and state and even regional level, what are some things that are consistent across all of the educational sectors, so K-12, community colleges, and our four-year partners. And you can see some of those threads there on the screen. The one that I've highlighted is one that we want to spend some time talking about today. And that's the idea that inequities that may have already been in our environment have become more visible. So we see them because of the way that our landscape has shifted almost overnight. We see them more readily, maybe in ways that we didn't see them before. And they are more acute for places where we already saw, or populations where we already were seeing that there was some disproportionate impact or inequity. So while we're planning for the fall, we really want to keep that idea of how can we mitigate the inequities to the degree that we can. We want to keep that in mind because as we discussed, one of the things that is not going to change, regardless of what comes next, is our mission and our focus on providing exemplary learning environments through and advancing equity and inclusion to help our students be more successful. So that's what where we're gonna start from today, and that will be a focus of our conversation. So speaking of what we're gonna do today, why are we here? We wanna spend some time gaining perspective on students' lived experience in this moment. If we're gonna talk about inequity and the ways that we're seeing that more visibly, or the ways that they're becoming more acute, we really wanna focus on what students are telling us that their experiences are like. So we'll gain some perspective on self-reported needs from the emergency applications, the emergency grant applications that have been available to students since the beginning of April. And we're going to be thinking about their experiences with COVID-19 and how that can inform our planning. we also want to reflect on those experiences using the equity framework that, if you were here on Friday, Lida gave us an overview of this framework. So we'll go a little deeper into that framework today. But really the purpose of that framework is to help us uncover some of our assumptions and blind spots that may be affecting how we come to the work of planning and how we receive information that we're hearing from our students. So that framework is really designed to help us open up our thinking so that we can plan more effectively. And as we're having those dialogues and as we're doing the planning, we want to be identifying those barriers that are either new or now we can see them more clearly. Anything that seems to be a new or more visible barrier to equitable access and success, so that we can plan to address those as we move forward. And then finally, really we're trying to establish a collective foundation for equity-focused planning as we move into our next annual planning and prioritization cycle. We'll talk a little bit more about that at our wrap-up session on Friday, but the dialogues that we have today are really the foundation for everything that comes next. So, okay. And with that, let's go ahead and hear a little bit about what students are saying about their experiences. So I'm gonna let Victoria and Nancy Romero Lopez, and they are research. So you know Victoria as our college-based research analyst. Nancy Lopez is our new Guided Pathways Institutional Effectiveness Specialist. I think is her official title. Nancy, you can correct me if I'm wrong about that when you jump into the presentation. But they have been doing an analysis of the applications that came in, the emergency aid applications, and they're going to tell us about the themes that are emerging. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Victoria, you should have screen sharing abilities.
Okay, thank you. All right. So can you see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay. So as Catherine mentioned, Nancy did a lot of work on going through the Student Equity and Achievement Grant applications that were received. So we're going to talk about some of the data and findings we observed from looking at that. So just to give an overview, our data only includes applications that were submitted between March 25th and April 1st. There have been more applications that have been submitted since, but this only includes applications up to April 1st. And in the application, students were asked to identify what their needs were from a set of pre-chosen, pre-selected different needs, but then they were also given the opportunity to describe what some of those needs were that weren't covered. They were asked to describe in detail their reason for needing assistance. And they were also asked if they were receiving aid from any other sources, and if so, what those sources were. But overall, we saw that students' highest reported needs were mostly around basic necessities like food and rent, and that their needs were due in large part to COVID-related losses of income. So specifically, students were asked for their major, how many units they were enrolled in, to identify their needs from that pre-chosen list, to explain what other needs might be if they had other needs that weren't covered, to describe in as much detail as possible their reason for applying for aid, and if they were receiving any other funds, and if so, from where.
Hello, everyone. So as of April 1st, we received a total of 3,159 responses. We're still, as Victoria mentioned, we're still receiving more applications right now. Next slide, please. And the first question that was asked in the application was your major at Grossmont College, and the following were the most reported majors. So we have nursing, business, child development, psychology, and biology. Also, we also asked the students the number of units they were enrolled at Grossmont College, and 49.6% of the students reported full-time enrollment, and 45.6% reported part-time enrollment.
So students were asked to basically check all that apply from a list of needs that they could be experiencing. So you can see what those options were at the bottom of this bar graph. So for example, food, medical, transportation, personal auto, childcare. But as you can see from this graph, the most reported need was food, overwhelmingly, followed by gas and housing and utilities. So when students were asked to describe what other needs they might have, those descriptions fell into 4 different categories. So that could be personal, which included just a reiteration of need for food, help with bills and personal necessities. COVID-19 related needs, such as looking for work because they lost their job or they have a shortage of work hours. Needs around family, like helping family with bills, helping their family take care of their children or helping take care of their own children. And school-related needs like technology or Wi-Fi, laptop, and then just help paying for school materials or tuition fees. So of the students that reported that they had other needs, there were 706 students that said they had other needs. 415 of those communicated that they had needs related to personal matters, which again was including food and paying bills and other personal supplies. After that, it was school at 20% of those responses. So again, that was laptop, Wi-Fi, and then just help with tuition and fees and other school supplies. Family-related needs at 16%. So again, helping family with their financial situation or childcare situation. And then COVID-19 related needs.
Also, students were asked to describe in detail the reason they were applying for emergency assistance. And from the 3,159 applications, most of our students are reporting needing assistance because of COVID-19, which includes, again, shortage of work hours, job loss, or lack of funds due to the pandemic. And lastly, also students were asked if they were receiving other funds, and almost all of our students are not receiving any other outside funds.
So to go over our overall findings one more time, the most reported major was nursing, which we thought was interesting because those students are probably the best positioned to help the larger community during the situation. So they're the ones reporting needing the most support. There was equal representation from both full and part-time students. The most highly identified needs were around food, gas, and housing. And the majority of students reported they were applying for aid because of COVID-19 related losses of income. And finally, almost all students reported that they are not receiving any other kind of financial assistance. So if they ended up receiving funds, this was probably their primary source of aid during the situation. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Victoria and Nancy. Thank you for your good and quick work on this. I think there's probably going to be additional work on the applications that are as they come in. So stay tuned for updates there. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and get us back to our presentation. I also want to keep in mind that this is just one avenue or one instrument for collecting information from our students. So keep in mind that the experiences and the data that we've just shared with you are representing the experiences just through this application. There will be some other opportunities for gathering data about students' experiences as a result of COVID-19 that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. And again, I'm going to talk about those a little bit on Friday. Okay. So now what I'd like to do is turn things over to Lida so that she can take us through just a deeper look at the equity framework to set us up for the breakout discussions that we're going to have. So Lida, I've got the slides ready. And if I get behind in presentation, just tell me when you'd like me to advance.
Great, thank you. So this is just for those of you who were there on Friday, we're going to review the equity framework. And for the purposes of today and the situation we're in right now, based on our mission, vision, and values, the following guiding question will help inform our equity-minded planning process as it's related to our own practices, procedures, and resource allocation. This guiding question can help frame the discussion and embed equity into our planning and ultimately at the local decision-making processes. And so this guiding question of how does the current reality differentially impact historically underserved students at our institution? And it's asking us to really consider their experiences, academic, career outcomes, social mobility, and what other contextual factors that are affecting our students that are relevant to our planning discussions. Next slide, please. So if you remember, I briefly went over this on Friday with you all. I'm going to just kind of reiterate some of the things that are helpful in getting us started in the discussion. So the definition of equity that we are using is that equity takes into consideration the social identifiers, so race, gender, socioeconomic status, and they do affect equality. So in an equitable environment, an individual or a group would be given what is needed to give them equitable advantage. This would not necessarily be equal to what others are receiving. It could be more or different. So equity is an ideal and a goal. It ensures that everyone has the resources they need to succeed. The key principles around using this equity framework, we're hoping that this could be a tool to establish and use as a mechanism to get input from each other, to use for yourself and critical reflection, to use with your departments, your units, and your divisions. And that we're hoping that it will better understand the design for equity and that it's really about intentional planning and practices at the college. We're hoping that this can be a tool to help others think deeply about the college structures that are within the control of the institution, and that we have to be race conscious when we're thinking about this, so that we understand the lived experiences of our minoritized student populations to help better serve them. So in this, we're going to go through these three areas of the equity framework: the personal, the professional, and the structural. Next slide, please, Catherine. So Estella Ben-Simone talks about using choice points to become equity-minded. And the term choice points are those decision-making opportunities that influence outcomes. So one example of a personal choice point is consumer decisions: who your friends are, where you live. This goes back to really critically thinking about who you are, what you believe, and what you do. And Estella Ben-Simone says when you're race conscious of these choice points and their related impacts, we're less likely to replicate the status quo. And this opens new possibilities for equitable change. And that this ultimately, this personal impacts our professional, and it seeps into our work environments, our curriculum, what we choose to bring into the classroom, are the services that we may offer within our units, how we choose to think about our students and what they may need. So think back around what Victoria shared and think about what are some surprising things that came up in that data. Was it that you assumed that students needed computers right now and that maybe we didn't consider that food was in fact the biggest thing that they needed? Those are some of the examples. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of these questions with you. That's what you're going to do in your breakouts. But again, you'll see that on the top right hand, you'll see that it goes through personal, professional, structural. It gives you a little bit of framing of what we've discussed. The guiding question is on the bottom right-hand side, and then you'll see the deeper questions. The whole point of this is not to answer the questions, but it's really about processing what the questions are and why are they there. How does this maybe impact the way that we are thinking about equity now, and that how it's so exposed and unveiled and visible right now. So now you can just go through the next slides, Catherine. So you'll see this in the personal, you'll see more questions about this in the professional and the structural. So hopefully you'll get through all three of these. Again, the point is not to answer them, but it's really to reflect and engage on, okay, I see how this question is really asked. Why would this question be asked? Why is it important to ask this type of question? And I will hand it over to Catherine so that she can go over our breakouts.
Thanks, Lida. So when we get into the breakout rooms, each room is going to have a facilitator. There's going to be a few small group discussions. So you'll have a facilitator, and your room facilitators have the discussion prompts and the slides that, that Lida just walked through. So you'll have those up on the screen in front of you to really prompt your dialogue. You'll have about 25 minutes in the room, so that's roughly 8 minutes per area. So just work through those areas, keeping the data that you heard from Victoria and Nancy, and that guiding question that you saw, that you will see down in the little, the lower right-hand corner in the thought bubble, keeping those things in mind as you're talking. We'd like you to identify a spokesperson for your group, someone who would be willing to come back and share out either in the chat or with the full group at the end of the activity. So before you dive in and get too far, make sure you have an idea of who's going to share out at the end. Okay. We talked a little bit about this on Friday too, but just as a reminder, going into a dialogue like this, it's helpful to have some shared agreements or some group norms. Remember that we're being really intentional about this. So designing for and planning for equity, it's intentional. And we have to be very intentional about it, which is what we're doing today. I'm not going to go through all of these. Your facilitators have this slide as well. But I would just emphasize, be open, challenge ideas, not people. Ask why, tell me more when things come up that you're curious about, and just be open to being race conscious as we go into those discussions. Okay, and with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pause the recording, and we're going to get you into your breakout. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for sharing the thoughts that folks are putting into the chat. Keep those coming as needed. I want to talk a little bit in the time that we have left, just to set up for what's coming. So on Friday, so we've been doing these sessions. We had one Monday, one yesterday, and one today. And what the CPI team will do next tomorrow is kind of go through all of the comments that the groups are putting in chat, and come up with a way of reflecting that back to you on Friday, so that we can kind of bring that into the closing discussion on Friday and see what was emerging as consistent or interesting across the sessions. And then we want to really talk about what comes next and how we link that to our annual planning processes. And we'll talk a little bit about why those processes are really important. They're always important, but particularly important in the moment in which we find ourselves now. Wrapping up Friday, our week of planning, and then moving into the fall and beyond, we'll have an opportunity to make some adjustments to the annual unit plans. So particularly for those of you who are involved in that process in your area, the annual unit plans, we went through and we did a lot of work to say, here's what we need based on where we are right now. Well, in that moment, the right now was before the asteroid hit, so to speak. And so we want to have a chance to recalibrate, to revisit, to reprioritize. As we're thinking back to that hierarchy of needs, what are our own needs now in this? What are the immediate things that we absolutely must do right now? And how do we carry this idea of equity-focused planning into the fall in an environment where those inequities are so much more visible and acute? So on Friday, we'll talk a little bit about the timeline for the annual unit plans going forward and what that will look like. And then we'll have a chance to just, again, pause and reflect on the fact that we are in this together. I heard someone yesterday say that we are, it's not that we're all in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm, and we're gonna weather it together. So thank you for that from yesterday's participants. So thank you very much for coming today. We're learning together, and I really hope you come back on Friday. And I appreciate you, and I hope you're all doing well.